Hi, welcome back to another episode of What's Going On.
A Social Studies Network podcast. I'm Maeve.
And I'm Mary, and today we're talking about how to have difficult conversations.
This is a podcast where we talk about current events in the social studies field, and like Mary said, we'll be talking about how to have difficult conversations.
We're no strangers when it comes to having difficult conversations, so it's important to talk about how to have them, how to manage the discomfort, and how to have them productively.
Exactly. And we want to start off kind of by defining what is a difficult conversation. It's a very broad term. And I think how I define it is just anything that makes you like squirm in your seat a little bit. Something you, as humans, we want to avoid at all costs because it may cause discomfort in ourselves and others. And we want to just do what is best for the group. We want to imagine a perfect world where everything always goes according to plan, and we don't need to have these difficult conversations. But as we recognize, as we move forward, that these conversations will come up, especially on topics that make us uncomfortable. And I think many people don't realize that teaching is something that is political. It's always been political. And so to ignore this aspect of teaching is kind of doing everyone a disservice. And we need to start talking about how do we move forward from this. And what I mean by a disservice, in a way, it limits the opportunity for children to learn. Mm-hmm. And so as the lines between like school and home and the outside world and this classroom, they begin to blur, it's important to have these conversations with your students, with your colleagues, and even to encourage your students to have at home. So I want to like kind of get into it, like how do we prepare for something like this? And when this is what we go back and forth on is sometimes these topics come up all on their own. Sometimes teachers may want to incorporate current events into their classrooms. But for each situation, how can we prepare?
I think the number one thing you have to do first, right, is kind of assess the type of students you have and the classroom culture you have too, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah, it's definitely important to, read the room, read your classroom. Mm-hmm. Are you talking to younger kids? Are you talking to older kids? What demographics do your students come from? What do they know? What do they not know? And so that's something you build up over the course of the school year.
You have to take into account the things that interest your students and their values and the knowledge and experience that they bring from outside of the classroom, from their parents and their community. Mm-hmm. I think that will give you like a very good idea of what interests your students and what news article they might bring into the classroom or what activities you could structure for them.
Definitely. And this leads into acknowledging and being aware of the bias your students may bring into the classroom and your own bias as a teacher. Mm-hmm. I feel like that's something that's only beginning to be discussed, is that, well, we all have biases. And how do we approach certain topics and certain things without letting our biases get in the way of our opportunity to learn? So what do you think are some ways we can be aware and acknowledge our own bias?
I think a good starting point is kind of seeing the tendencies you have in your teaching and the ways that your students respond to it. Maybe some of the things you teach will resonate more with some, and some of them might alienate some more, and you want to look into why, right? Why is it that some students engage more with your teaching and some feel excluded, mm-hmm. right? And when you notice these biases, I think it's important not to try to erase them and be as unbiased as possible, but try to be mindful of what you're doing and reshape it to be more positive and constructive, right?
Exactly.
And that goes into building a very welcoming environment.
Exactly. And one of the ways to like establish that welcoming environment can be through things such as classroom norms. Classroom norms are things that maybe teachers discuss with their students at the beginning of the year, like what do the teachers expect from their students? What do the students expect from their teachers? And so some norms that would apply to situations like these could be mindful of your words when you're speaking, like thinking before you speak in a way. Active listening is always important.
And asking questions and realizing that mistakes are okay and welcoming it in your classroom. Letting your students know it's okay to be wrong and being ready to admit when you're wrong as well. Learning to be and encouraging being open with your feelings and emotions as you're having difficult conversations and really showing that vulnerability. Mm-hmm. Right? And all of that kind of culminates to being open to other people's experiences and opinions without being defensive, right? Mm-hmm. Being very receptive to what they have to say and what knowledge they have to share with you.
Yeah. And these are obviously just suggestions. Work with your students to create your classroom norms. But like you said, these are ways to foster a classroom environment that values and encourages critical thinking, curiosity, and making mistakes and being vulnerable with your students. It's also important to make discussion and conversation skills part of the curriculum that you're teaching. If you are planning to have those structured kinds of conversations, just preparing your students for different kinds of questions they can ask or different responses they can give is always important.
It's important to establish these skills in advance before you might have a difficult conversation when perhaps a student of yours might bring a current event into the classroom, so that you may be able to have a very productive discussion, right?
On that same plane, it's important to establish with your students the importance of knowing the facts and the truths and having their own critical thinking skills to discern fact from fiction and truth from false.
Right, and it's important to have critical thinking and being able to discern between fact and fiction, like you said, especially with current media nowadays when there's so much misinformation or complex topics or nuance that students might not be able to pick up if you don't practice these skills in the classroom. I think the most important part is the role you have to take, the facilitator, and then conversation skills, like what you actually have to do in the moment, right?
Yeah, and so the real question is, how do we act when the situation occurs? What can we do? And I think one of the most important things is knowing what the role of the teacher is in these types of conversations. What role do we play? Because it's important for us, for one, not to choose sides in any way or to make it seem that neither side is important and it's easy to just sweep this under the rug. So I think it's important for a teacher to act as a facilitator to help the conversation flow and step in when needed and step back when needed.
And I think as you facilitate, you can either take these two different approaches, right? Either really let the students take the stage and just make sure they're using their conversation and discussion skills productively, make sure they have the right information and they're not spreading misinformation, or take an active role and ask questions, try to figure out what these students think and why, and challenge their perspectives.
You could definitely take the approach of having the students try to convince you of their stance. Maybe it really does not matter what you believe, but making it to your students feel like they need to convince you. And so that allows them to use their conversation skills, to use their discussion skills in a way that can appeal to this almost neutral person, the person on the fence, as you are the facilitator.
And I think that's a very interesting exercise too, because it values the students' opinions and it gives students the opportunity to express their opinions and, like you said, practice their conversation and discussion skills, seeing how other people respond to their arguments, their opinions, and trying to make sense of that and navigating that.
It's definitely important for students to understand how their opinions and their arguments affect others, whether it is their opinion or something they're assigned to give an opinion on. And those are just one of many things that students can use when they're having these difficult conversations. Things such as being an active listener. We're moving back onto these norms, like being an active listener, being aware of how your words and opinions affect others, putting into practice the norms you've worked throughout the semester, throughout the year. And there are many other skills that may not follow the typical classroom norm that are very applicable to these kinds of discussions, such as knowing when to step down, knowing when you need a time to cool off, knowing when you need to maybe step back, cool down a bit, knowing how to ask questions about other people's arguments. And especially maybe not to take things too personally, or let emotions get the best of you, because at the end of the day, these are maybe discussions we're only having in the classroom.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is kind of leaning into this discomfort of having difficult conversations. I think a lot of us, especially people that are like peacemakers or like a harmony in the classroom, will try to shy away from these conversations because they don't want to maybe alienate students or feel like their relationship with them is compromised. But It's important to have these conversations with students, not just for the curriculum or for what they might learn from it, but also to develop your relationship with them. I think in a discussion, it's important to acknowledge when you're feeling uncomfortable and be open about what you might feel. If you feel like a topic is too sensitive for you in the moment, or feeling other powerful emotions as well. For example, if you're feeling angry, you might want to communicate that so that you may take time to cool down and have a more productive discussion that isn't just emotion based, right?
I feel like we don't talk about enough that it's never too late to return to a conversation, whether that be later that day or the next day or a week later.
And along with having follow-ups, you also do want to have space for reflection. I think it's important while you're discussing to maybe have times of silence where you just let yourself think and don't react right away. But then also, like, perhaps a few days after you have a discussion, let your student have space to just think and let yourself have space to think as well. So that when you do come back together, your thoughts are more developed and you can have a nice conclusion or continue the conversation you had before.
Definitely, I agree, like making space for reflection, whether that is something that comes with that structured or unstructured discussion. And it can take many forms, like you said. It could be like a moment of silence, or it can come in like, oh, written response, whatever you feel is best for the situation or the conversation that occurred. And I don't think this is something that only applies to students. I think, as you were kind of getting at, teachers also will need to take that time to reflect and maybe having to determine, is that something they need to return to or something they might need to change their lesson on in the future?
I think it's especially important to adjust your curriculum if you see that certain topics are of interest to your students or it was a conversation that engages your classroom.
It'll help you better understand what your students are interested, what they want to talk about, and it's always great to have that student feedback. Some example questions you could ask your students was, what were some of the most compelling arguments made by others in the class? Or how could the discussion relate to the broader themes of the class? Or you could also ask what the student could have done differently, what they wish they said but they didn't.
Now that we've taken the time to discuss how to prepare, act, and reflect on difficult conversations, we also want to take some time to expand on what the different roles teachers might have in these situations.
Specifically being a model to the student, modeling these behaviors we've discussed, but also being vulnerable and being human. In these ways, teachers are able to build these relationships with their students and have these conversations.
Right. You really do want to focus on the humanity and the individuality and the importance of your students and their perspectives. As you're managing these difficult conversations, you also want to be mindful of the way they're affecting students. You don't want these difficult conversations and events and information to be harmful to the classroom culture. You want them to be constructive to the students.
I think a great way to do this is to remember to teach with hope in your students. Try not to build problem on top of problem on top of problem, or put students into these situations where they have to feel like they're on guard. They have to protect themselves and their opinions.
You don't want to just inform them of problems and not give them solutions to them or avenues of hope, like you said. You want to inform students not just of the oppression they might see in their day-to-day lives, but also the ways other people have resisted it and how they might, on top of informing students about oppression and resistance, you also have the responsibility as an educator to bring in different views and perspectives on a complex issue, right? Even if you might think one side is harmful or wrong, for example, you do want to introduce these ideas to students and explain the context behind them so that they might understand the different views and understand the impact of these views in the greater world.
You have that responsibility to be there for your students, to answer their questions, to guide them through these difficult conversations, and to model these behaviors.
We didn't talk about this a lot, but you also want to encourage an environment where curiosity is valued and your students want to ask questions. They want to inquire into the world they live in. You want them to build these questions inside of the classroom and take them outside of it, or see what's going on in their world and bring those into the classroom and look to you for a source of information or as a guide to direct them towards resources and information that might help them answer their questions.
That's very important. Take that with you. Encourage inquiry in your classroom. Circling back, today we talked about different ways to prepare, act, and reflect on difficult conversations. Also, the importance of being a model to your students and facilitating difficult conversations. These conversations may be difficult, but they happen every day. It's important to lean into that discomfort and grow from it. This has been What's Going On, a Social Studies Network podcast. I'm Maeve.
And I'm Mary, and as always, we want to remind you to take care and stay aware.